take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's Connecting the Dots time again, and we today have a wonderful program on called Wolves and Other Predators, 2- and 4-legged predators that threaten rural America. And on my program today, I have Dr. Valerius Geist, who is a PhD and a professor. He's retired now, but a professor at the University of Calgary, and he has built a career on understanding wildlife and understanding the ecology of different natural systems. And Dr. Geist is currently working with the European Union and with others and writing a number of papers on the problem with wolves. And Dr. Geist, I know you came into this with really your background being understanding herding and ungulates and different types of let's say vegetarian wildlife on the natural ecosystem, and wolves came in because they were starting to be a problem, and so you had to deal with the understanding that the wolves were really having a huge impact on the ungulates and on the entire environment. So anyway, with that, I would love to have you introduce yourself to our listeners. I gave a little intro, but you've got a lot more to tell our listeners, and then we can talk about some of the things that you've uncovered and some of the ideas that you have found to be very, very false in the reintroduction, supposedly, of Canadian gray wolves into the natural environment in the continental United States. So with that, Dr. Geist, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dan. Well, you're quite right. I have, during my career as a university professor at the University of Calgary, I was involved to a large extent with wildlife, and the wildlife that I was studying, and I was also not studying just simply wildlife, but policies of wildlife conservation. This included the North American model of wildlife conservation, which I'm the original writer of. And after I retired in 1995 and settled on the Vancouver Island, I had no thought, in fact, of continuing on with any of this. I was looking forward to doing some fly fishing, in fact, and some hand loading. And, well, I didn't get very far because all of a sudden we had around our place, I have 28. I'm sorry. Something is happening again, Dan.
No, we're fine. I saw that too, but I think it was just a temporary blip.
Okay.
We'll monitor.
Well, the point was that 4 years after retirement, we had a wolf pack coming around our house, and I was totally astonished at what I was seeing. You see, I had quite a bit of opportunity to observe wolves when I was a young man, particularly in the northern British Columbia. I was living for 2 years isolated in the wilderness, and I was studying stone sheep and mountain goats then. And my next-door neighbors were two native families of tall tan living about 40 miles away. That's how empty the landscape was of people. And we had an enormous amount of wildlife there, and also a wolf pack that came through roughly every 2 weeks. And I could hear them early in the morning howling, and I would get out then and put my spotting scope out. The country was wide open. Timber lines were low. Visibility was excellent. And so I was able to observe these gigantic wolves on a regular basis. And it's important to notice that these were gigantic wolves. The wolves during that time period, in fact, were, as I said, relatively rare. The pack that I observed counted 7 individuals, and it was 7 individuals the second year too. It didn't reproduce apparently, and I didn't realize what that meant in those days. But the important thing was that I was surrounded by tremendous abundance of caribou and moose and mountain sheep and mountain goats and so on and so forth. And so that when the wolves showed up on Vancouver Island in 1999, I was very surprised what happened, because what happened was that the countryside was very quickly cleaned completely of wildlife by the wolves. We had deer, for instance, just simply poured out of the foresty regions into the suburbs and into the farms. And from where I'm sitting now, actually, I'm looking at the barns of my neighbor, and along the barns at night, there were deer resting, one deer beside the other. I mean, totally unnatural. We had powerful lights to observe that. So something very odd was happening. So, of course, I was well connected. I picked up the phone and I called my dear late friend, Erich Klinghammer. Professor Erich Klinghammer had developed Wolf Park in Battleground, Indiana, and he had worked for years and years and years with wolves. And so I right away was in very good hands in terms of understanding what wolves were doing. Well, to put it, tell you more or less quickly what happened was these wolves were starvation specimens, and they very quickly targeted us, human beings. And in fact, my neighbor and his wife were attacked by 5 wolves about 350 yards from where I'm sitting right now. And it was a remarkable thing because he survived this attack. Circumstances were extremely favorable for him. His wife jumped into the caboose of a excavator that was happened to be standing there, and she observed it from up high what he was doing. He had found a branch on the ground, and he was smashing into these wolves. Then when she realized that he was gaining ground, she jumped out and ran towards my house, shouting, "Val, Val, get the gun, John, wolves." And I had been sitting behind the computer still in my morning gown, and I grabbed hold of the rifle, and with morning gown flying, I ran as hard as I could towards in the direction. And I arrived just a few seconds too late. John had succeeded in beating back the wolves, and he said that if any of these wolves had any caries in their teeth, he would have seen them. It was that close. Now, these wolves didn't learn a damn thing about what they were doing, because he and I went out the following evening looking for them, and it so happened that they came out where he was. He fired. One of the wolves dropped, rolled over, and then jumped up again and ran away, and the whole pack just melted into the bush. That was in the evening. Next morning, he and his wife again went out. They were dairy farmers. They were looking after the herds out in the pastures. And about 200 yards beyond where they were attacked for the first time, they were attacked the second time. This time he carried a rifle, a very useful rifle, a 243 Winchester in a Model 99 Savage, and he killed the largest wolf. It weighed 75 pounds, I know, because I weighed it. And that animal had a nick on the lower jaw, and that is apparently where the bullet struck the night before as such. So the point is that the next 3 years, I was introduced to a interesting reality, namely the reality when wolves begin to target human beings as potential prey. And there were several other attacks, incidentally, on that was not the only attack that we observed. In fact, at one point my wife ran into the house because we had one wolf advance onto our dog in heat. Our dog was a German long-hair pointer, the so-called Greater Münsterländer, and Susu was in heat and behind, sitting in a grape arbor behind tall fences. But this wolf was quite assertive, and my wife simply had to go inside the house to get away from that. So you see, living in the boonies after you retire has certain advantages. You can get to see interesting things, to say the very least. So that is how I began, because now this was something unusual, and I was very quickly talking with other people, and I developed during that time a sort of a model, it's called the escalation model now, of how wolves behave when they increasingly get closer and closer and closer to attacking human beings. And there was an attack, a major attack, about 120 miles or so from here, onto a camper. And this was done by two wolves which were in the last stages of getting familiar with human beings. The wolves are in amongst the people. This was a campground. And of course the campers were quite thrilled to see the wolves amongst themselves. And the wolves were nipping at the clothing of people, and they were licking the exposed skin of people, and then about 2 weeks later they attacked. And the man was saved barely, but had 80 stitches and so to look after. Anyway, I wrote out this model, escalation model, and it turns out that two colleagues in California observing coyotes targeting children in urban parks developed a virtually identical model. Their model has 6 steps, my model had 7 steps. We're still laughing about it. It's otherwise identical. But what happens is that the little wolf and the big wolf both have the same way of targeting people as eventual prey. Now, this model now carries my name in Europe, and what I'm being told is that it predicts with eerie accuracy. Well, why shouldn't it? If I were to study moose, which I have, by the way, in America, I don't expect that the moose in Norway behave much different from the ones that I observed here. And the same thing with wolves. So we had a pretty good understanding then of what happens when wolves come into a settled landscape and begin to expand and explore. There comes eventually a point where they will attack human beings. The point is very close in Europe at the present time, but it's taking longer there for the very simple reason that they have so much more food than we have here on Vancouver Island. This is an island with low biodiversity. We don't have, as I said, the amount of wildlife that the Germans enjoy, and the wolves are expanding slowly, roughly at 30 to 35% a year, and are spreading outward. And only a few days ago did the German government agree that they will allow wolves that prey on livestock to be taken out, but every single shot has to be authorized by authorities. In other words, if you miss, it's just simply too bad. You're going to have to wait for another authorization to shoot again.
Wow.
I'm sorry, but this is the reality. The insanity is quite something. So we have in Europe a very, very strong political movement in the Greens, and they are determined to ensure that the wolves spread and occupy Germany. And some individuals said they were welcoming the wolves. They didn't realize, of course, what they're welcoming. What they're welcoming is the beast of battle. Now, that is how wolves were known in antiquity, along with ravens, along with eagles, and with vultures. So as soon as there was a human battlefield, before Christianity was still in place, the combatants were very, very keenly aware that they had to act quickly to recover any corpse, because the belief was that if the wolves and the ravens were able to consume the corpse, that individual would not be able to go to Valhalla, which was the great heaven of the heroes in those days. And it would be a shame on the family that this happened. And so if a warrior died in battle, his companions and relatives tried very, very quickly to retrieve his body and to give it a proper cremation and funeral, so that he might go, in fact, to the heaven of those days. So the beast of battle was very well known, was very, very, very much feared, as a matter of fact, and this was reflected in the writings of some of the medics that we have from the Balkan Wars of 1912, for instance, the Turks and the no, not Romanians. But anyway, yeah, I'll remember it in a moment.
Well, what is now?
They were fighting.
Well, it was Yugoslavia, the Balkan.
Well, no, it was not Yugoslavia. It was the neighbor to Romania, to the south, Bulgaria. That's what it was.
Oh, okay.
The Bulgarians and the Turks were fighting in the Balkan War. And they got themselves into horrendous situations. The medic said there was no point shooting at these wild creatures. You simply wasted your ammunition because there were so many of them. And they wrote that wolves had a distinct taste for human flesh and preferred that above and beyond the flesh of dead horses, let's say, that were also lying on the battleground. And you must remember that after a battle there would be tens of thousands of corpses out there. And the wolves were having a wonderful time. And, of course, all the other beasts of battle as well. And when the corpses were consumed, then, of course, they started going in after the living soldiers and made life very difficult for them. And so there were at times truce developed, and during one truce, the Bulgarian cavalry went out and killed in one day 145 wolves. So that's quite a number of wolves, to say the very least, as well as I think it was something like 40 or 50 jackals as well. So the beast of battle is something that is known from the historical information. And there is a lot of historical writing available, of course, and the problem is that in Europe and in North America, this historical writing has been ignored. And it has been systematically ignored, as a matter of fact. I can tell you the reason how it developed, but the important thing is that this knowledge was simply not made available, but it did not become the basis for political action, which is slowly but surely developing now the case. So wolves will eat human beings, and there is another important matter, and that is the reason, of course, that I called my friend Erich Klinghammer right away when the wolves were becoming a little bit aggressive around here, is because this was so bloody unusual. The lore was that North American wolves just don't attack human beings. And we were wondering, and what was the reason for that, and we were wondering whether the American wolves were genetically so different from Siberian wolves. And we had no answer for it. And it's absolutely true that the attack on humans is a great, great exception, and one of those exceptions was, of course, the Kenton Carnegie case, the young student from University of Waterloo who was killed by wolves in northern Saskatchewan while he was there on a visit. He was a student of mining and geology, and he was there to inspect the mine. And the long and the short of it was that he was killed and eaten by wolves. And I was asked to investigate that killing by his parents, and I've done so and written about that, of course. But the overriding observations were that wolves in North America just didn't go after people. Well, there was actually a very good reason why they didn't. And I discovered that eventually. And the reason runs as follows. You see, throughout northern Canada, and of course also Alaska, you had, in these wide open wilderness spaces, trappers, which were actively looking after trap lines. And the number of trappers in Canada was about 60,000 across the north, roughly speaking, 60,000. Well, the number of wolves today, when they're quite abundant, is about 60,000 in the same landscape. And in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when they were being prosecuted much more severely, there were probably about half as many wolves. And so that you had throughout northern Canada, for every wolf, one or two trappers. Now, trap lines are large, but the territories that wolves roam over are much, much larger. And so that throughout the week of a wolf's life, he would be almost certainly bumping into people. Now, the trappers in the North Country were not exactly thrilled by the presence of wolves, because the wolves destroyed fur by following the trappers and the trap lines. They attacked their dogs and killed them, and sled dogs were vitally important for transportation. When wolves showed up and wildlife disappears, and I can vouch for that, my goodness, does it ever disappear. And so these poor people, and the trappers were very poor men, working very, very hard for a poor living. They depended on wildlife for food, and when wolves appeared, well, moose and deer and elk and everything else disappeared. And they were in great anxiety. So the net result was that you had, for decades and decades on end, a vast area of North America in which the number of people virtually outnumbered the number of wolves on the same ground. And so that wolves were continually in contact with people. Now, wolves are very intelligent, very intelligent. They've got much larger brains than dogs have, by the way. They have also different ways of learning than dogs have. And they are ruthlessly logical in what they learn. And they avoid people. And that was the reason why, over a whole continent, you had no attacks on people, because you had extremely well-educated wolves. Well, of course, these wolves you'd hardly ever see. Once wolves are prosecuted, they are at masters at making themselves scarce at the right moment, of course. And so the number of wolves killed by trappers was actually quite low. It turns out that it varied somewhat between one wolf per 3 or 5 trappers per year. But there was an additional killing of wolves, namely native people were in the country that some of the tribes were not very happy with wolves, and they killed them. Hunters killed them. Game wardens killed them. Then we had unsettled landscapes officers, predator control officers paid by the state, which made sure that there were no wolves in ranch country. They were removed. And this had a very happy consequence. The number of wolves were low. They lived in packs that were intact. They were gigantic because there was so much wildlife because of the continuous control of wolves. There was so much wildlife available. And I know it. I lived it in the 1950s and 60s as a young biologist. And so the wolves grew, of course, to very large size. That's the reason why they were gigantic. There was no integration whatsoever between coyotes and wolves, because when wolves are in packs and the coyote shows up, well, the coyote is toast. He will be eaten. That's all there is to that. The same thing with dogs. There's no hope of hybridization as long as the wolves are living in natural, intact packs. And so they were removed from the coyote country, because the coyote country basically was the ranch country. and the coyotes there were being controlled as well. So we had a situation where we had perfectly functioning wolf populations in packs, and we had no danger of these animals being hybridized out of existence, which is exactly, of course, what your legislation and the legislation in the European countries is guaranteeing now. Your legislation in the United States ensures that we're going to coy wolf the whole bloody continent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the coy wolf is a product of wolves hybridizing with coyotes and dogs. And right now you have quite a large number of these in the eastern United States, and they're roughly 60% wolf, 30% coyote, and 10% dog. That's roughly speaking what they are. And they're perfectly worthless, of course. They're worthless hybrids. They're not a natural species at all. And the great irony is that all these attempts to save wolves in North America by protecting them only generates a system whereby the wolf is degraded decade by decade into a feral dog. In other words, what you are doing right now in the name of conservation is actually destroying the wolf. And I have to say it even more bluntly, you're destroying it as a natural Darwinian species. And this is the ultimate irony, because wolves create in human landscapes, settled landscapes, tremendous agonies for people, and tremendous dangers. And not only from the fact that they prey on domestic animals, which they do, of course, and make ranching quite unprofitable, to say the least, in fact, at times impossible. And not only that, it gets to the stage where people that own ranches and are ready to retire and want to sell the ranches, like what's happening in New Mexico, they can't sell the ranch because nobody wants to buy it. Nobody wants to buy a ranch with wolves on it. And so these poor people are sitting there. What are they going to do? And the other thing that has been totally overlooked is that the wolves bring diseases into the landscape. Now, when I was a student, we had, in fact, quite a bit of a problem with hydatid disease. Hydatid disease is caused by the dog tapeworm that you find in wolves. And what happens is that the wolf passes the eggs of that tapeworm. Now, this tapeworm is very small, and there are thousands of them in the gut of a wolf, and they continuously produce eggs, and the eggs go out with the feces of the wolf, and the feces gets hit by sunshine and wind and so on and dries out, and the eggs fly away and are easily distributed. And so one of the most important things that your audience should know is if you ever are out in the wilds and you run into some wolf feces, wolf scat, do not poke around in it, because you might liberate these eggs and you may inhale them, and you may swallow them with your sputum, and then you are infected. And it's a terrible disease, to say the very least. I'll get to that in a moment. But the first important thing is that the wolves are the carriers of this very, very vile parasite. And in fact, so vile that, for instance, in Finland, at one point when this disease began to spread, the army went up in the aircraft and machine guns and started to kill every wolf they could find. What happens is the following. When the eggs are dispersed around the fecal site, oh, by the way, if your wolves show up around your house and on your lawn, and they poop on your lawn, make sure you don't run over that poop with your lawnmower. Mm-hmm. Because if you do, you spread the stuff everywhere, and you may be the first victim of it. Yeah, and the same thing goes also for machines working with hay. It's quite easy to disturb this dry wolf scat and spread the eggs everywhere, and they are airborne, and you can get them. And it is very, very important to act very hygienically, but I'll get to that in a moment, because the first thing that happened when I was a young student still, the first thing we were taught in our parasitology classes by one professor called James Adams was that we had to be very careful around wolf scat. You don't poke into it, and when you collect it for scientific purposes, you have to be very careful with plastic bags and so on and so forth. But the most important thing is that you stay away as much as possible, and then of course you wash your hands all the time, and you don't handle wolves, if you can at all, with naked with your hands without any gloves, because the eggs may also be in the hair of the wolf, because the wolf licks its own anus and then it licks its hair and then transfers the eggs from the anus into the hair. So one of the things, it's horrifying to me to see happy hunters in Montana or Idaho, wherever they are, lifting up these great big wolves and pressing them to their body as they show off their trophy, because that's one way in which you can catch the disease. So the most important thing is, if you ever handle any wolves, is that you wash your hands thoroughly. And by the way, in my family in Russia, we had one member die of the disease, and so my grandfather was quite paranoid about the disease. Everybody had to wash hands, and he didn't allow a dog in the house. And in fact, the absence of dogs in family dwellings, particularly in Asia and in the Near East, is because of the disease. And the dogs are considered unclean for a darn good reason. They may be carriers of the disease, and that's where the great danger, of course, lies. Because if, for instance, you have infected elk, as you now have in Montana and Idaho, by the way, and Wyoming, you have elk infected by this parasite, and the infection is in the form of cysts, which grow in the lung, in the liver, in the brain, in other body parts, of course. But 80% or so are in the liver, 20% roughly, and the lungs, and just a few in the brain, and so on. Now, these cysts grow larger and larger and larger to the size of grapefruit and beyond. And inside the cyst, you see something like a little tiny yellow grain. Well, each one of these yellow grains is actually the head of a little tapeworm. And when the wolf comes along and kills a elk, and by the way, the elk get, of course, disabled to quite an extent by these cysts growing in their lungs, then the wolf swallows the cyst, and the little tapeworm heads are liberated, and they attach themselves to the gut, grow into adults, and produce eggs, and so that closes the cycle again. So the cycle is that the wolf defecates out the eggs, the elk and the deer feed around the vegetation that is close by. The eggs are volatile, they're blown around by the wind, they've contaminated the grasses and the plants, and of course also the mushrooms and the berries, and you're supposed to be very, very careful about where you pick mushrooms and berries in the wild, because there may be a infective heap of wolf poop somewhere close by. And so then the little tiny eggs develop, are swallowed, and they drill through the gut into the blood system, and they are being caught by the first capillary bed that they meet, which is usually the liver, and then the next one is the lung, and there they develop into cysts. And that is now called the hydatid disease. Now, when I was a student, this was a problem, because in northern British Columbia, and northern Alberta, of course, but in British Columbia, I went to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. The normal transportation mode for trappers was dog sleds. And unfortunately, trappers would feed the infected viscera of moose and caribou and elk and so on to the dogs that they had. And the dogs would, of course, become infected with a parasite, and they would shed feces infected with eggs, and some of these feces got onto the harnesses of the dog sleds, and the harnesses were being handled, of course, daily, and they didn't always wash their hands, and before you knew it, they were infected. So, and then they would show up, of course, with these horrible cysts in their bodies at the Vancouver General Hospital. And Professor James Adams was the first-rate photographer And he went in and he made a point of studying this disease, and he brought back the most horrible slides that I've ever seen in my life. It is unbelievable what it looks like when you open up the body cavity of a human being that is infected with hydatid disease. He not only brought back these unbelievable slides, he also brought back the shop talk from the operating rooms. And the shop talk was very important for the following reason. These cysts are quite fragile. So during an operation, it can happen that a cyst bursts. And if a cyst bursts, then even the tiniest fragment from the inside of the wall of the cyst that remains behind in a patient after the operation will grow again into another cyst, and the disease will continue on and on and on. So the doctors were experimenting with various means and ways of operating so that if an accidental breakage of a cyst occurred, it would not reinfect the patient again. And that included trying to operate on patients upside down, which I've never seen anywhere in the literature, by the way. But this was part of the shop talk, which we as students were now exposed to. And all I can tell you is none of my colleagues remembers anything except these horrendous slides that we were shown by Professor Adams. And so the important thing is not just simply that the wolf is a carrier of the disease, but the most important thing is that domestic dogs will become infected. And for instance, you have hikers going out into the countryside during hunting season, and their pooches running with them. And in the hunting season, elk and deer hunters have been out there, and they've killed some elk and deer and left the viscera out in the countryside. And, the majority of the elk and deer eventually will, of course, be carriers of this parasite, and their viscera will be infected with these cysts. So the dog eats the cysts, and you don't notice it, or nobody notices, and within 7 weeks, it begins to pass now infective feces on the lawns, in the driveway, and people get it onto the veranda, they get into the house, and on a daily basis they bring in more and more and more of these eggs, and baby is crawling around on the floor, and baby puts its little hand into its mouth, and there you go. Baby is infected. And it takes about 10 years for these cysts to grow to very large size. And when they do, one of the dangers is that when the child, which has now a belly full of cysts, and there comes a point where it becomes quite uncomfortable and painful, and organ failures begin to set in. But if they are playing and get hit on the belly, for instance, and one of these tender cysts bursts, well, a certain number of children, I think it was about 3%, die right then and there on the spot from anaphylactic shock. And the rest have to be brought in for operation, and chances are they're in for a very miserable life. And who's going to pay for all that? Mm-hmm. This is a very expensive deal to be treated surgically for hydatid disease. And you see, right now you've introduced the wolves. The hydatid disease, the parasite, is now spreading in Montana and Idaho and Wyoming and so on, and in Colorado, where they've discovered it already, of course. And eventually your farm dogs will become infected with it because some hunters or even the rancher owner himself has shot something and left the viscera out there without knowing and understanding that if the dog eats it, it will bring that to his family. It will bring the disease to the family. And so the first people that are affected, I would think, we have to look after are the ranchers themselves. The other people that will be affected is wherever there is feces left by wolves around buildings, on lawns, on hay fields, that this feces will, after it gets dried and gets disturbed mechanically or by, as I said, lawnmowers, for instance, or haying machines, they will lead to infections in humans. And it's a very, very tragic one. That's all I can say. And unfortunately, this was not taken into consideration adequately when wolves were being reintroduced, and are still being reintroduced, into North America and into Europe. So this is something that's coming. It's, as I said, I'm aware now that you have the disease in the wolves. The latest figures are that it's over 60% of the wolves shot had the disease. So it's a horrible number. It's going to get more, of course. I've seen already the first elk that have been affected by the disease. You can see that on the crooked antlers of the bulls. This disease takes a lot out of the animals that are infected. And so the elk begin to show the disease. So this is another aspect that was not considered adequately when wolves were being introduced. It's almost shameful to see the justifications for the introduction of the animals, because there were such big holes in the knowledge by the people in the United States. And
absolutely. And Dr. Geis, that's one of the things that we talked about, the fact that the most radical elements of the environmental movement were the ones that were the most supportive of so-called wolf reintroductions. And, of course, we did have our native timber wolves in Montana and throughout the Rocky Mountain area. But, as you say, they were trained, they were educated wolves, and as a result, there weren't a lot of problems with the wolves, and they lived in the natural environment and didn't create a lot of problems. Well, when they brought these Canadian gray wolves down into the area, they created a lot of problems that were just not anticipated. And all I can say is that it's amazing to me that the most radical environmentalists, the people like David Foreman, who was the founder of Earth First, which was described by the FBI as a environmental terrorist organization, he was the one that was the biggest promoter of this, and yet. Look at the results. Look at what's happening as a result of these wolves. So yes, go ahead. I thought maybe you needed a little bit of a break there, but tell our listeners about some of the things that are happening. You mentioned New Mexico. The so-called Mexican red wolf, as it turns out, is a kind of a coy wolf that you're talking about, mostly had dog genes in that, so they aren't a real natural native wolf, and in fact we're really destroying the native wolf population completely.
Well, first of all, there is controversy about the taxonomy of both of your red wolf and the Mexican wolf. I can't go into that. It's convoluted and in some detail of it. So you had the attempts to save both of these wolves, the red wolf and the Mexican wolf, and it has caused a considerable number of problems, precisely because you were dealing at times with wolves that had been raised by human beings. And so that what to me was so offensive was that the brutality with which these animals were being introduced and maintained so that human beings were suffering. You haven't yet any attacks there on human beings, but children were being put into cages virtually to ensure that none of the wolves would attack them. But if I could get back for a moment on the red wolf, that's an interesting situation, because about the time of your revolution, it's 1776, you had a noted naturalist, a botanist, but also he was a very good naturalist. I can't remember his name right now, but I do know that he was traveling through Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida. And he reported in 1776 that he saw nothing but black wolves. Now, that's the country where the red wolves are supposedly. So how come you had black wolves? And he said, yes, he had it on good account that occasionally you had a gray wolf and a white wolf in there. But he said the only white hair he ever saw were white spots on the chest of the black wolves. That's all he saw. Well, he also saw in those days a large number of buffalo. And when you go and you look at the history of buffalo, and I have looked at that history, I've written a book on buffalo, you find that wherever the buffaloes were expanding in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, they were always accompanied by wolves, by a large number of wolves. And the buffaloes in the east were, of course, in more or less forested country, not just simply open country. And in forested country, the dark phase of the wolf has an advantage. So what basically you were seeing in those days were buffalo wolves throughout the areas occupied by buffalo. And the buffaloes were in Georgia, and they were in Louisiana. I don't know if they were in Florida. I don't think they went that far. But the wolf obviously did. And so the question is, what exactly are you protecting with the so-called red wolf? Well, we do know that the red wolf that you have today as a red wolf is actually a human artifact. And it was created in zoological gardens. This was an attempt to rewild the species, to get it back, because the red wolf officially went extinct. But here was an attempt made to recreate the species again by taking coyotes and breeding them in such a fashion that they looked more or less like what the breeders thought were red wolves. And this was an official program by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, of course. And so that the whole question is your red wolf even a wolf? We know that's about 60% wolves genes in it, and 40% coyote and dog, of course. It's a coy wolf, in other words. But it enjoys official status at the present time, and it's sort of a fake species. Now, I have read the history of the Mexican wolf. It's a bit convoluted, but the point of the matter is that very, very likely it has all sorts of genes in it which are not, in fact, belonging into the Mexican wolf itself. But what you have today as a Mexican wolf resembles more or less what you have seen previously. And today the claim is by geneticists that it's a pure wolf. And I do know that from the older skins and skulls where genetic tests have been made, that your so-called Mexican wolves did carry a lot of coyote genes in the past. So these are active programs. They're fairly dogmatically carried on. But the question is, what are you preserving? Certainly not preserving the pure wolf that existed in the past. And in fact, when Cabeza de Vaca, Alvarez Cabeza de Vaca, the Spaniard's nobleman and combat officer, when he went through Florida and Louisiana and Texas and so on, he never saw a single coyote. He never saw a single wolf. The first wolves were seen by the De Soto expedition about a dozen years later in Louisiana. You see, the landscape was so well populated by people when in 1527 to 1536 that, to give you an example of the scarcity of wildlife, when the native hunters in Florida went deer hunting, they took water and wood along. So, because where they were hunting deer, where deer were present, there was no water and no wood. But where there was water and wood to burn, there were no deer. So even the white-tailed deer was a scarce animal. And they were quite well armed, actually. As I said, Alvarez Cabeza de Vaca was a combat officer, so he had a real eye for it. And he said that they were using a very heavy bow that shot arrows accurately up to 200 yards. Wow. And the armor of the Spaniards provided no protection against the arrows of the native people. Those arrows penetrated the armor completely, and they penetrated horses completely, and they penetrated trees that were as thick as a man's leg as well. So they were very, very good. They had a first-rate weapon for killing everything that was large. And for instance, the Spaniards never saw a single alligator. Because there were so many people there, and they were so starved, and so they had ceremonies for allowing hunger to be tolerated. So when they were eating insects and spiders and so on, do you think they're going to let an alligator go by? Of course not. They would eat it, and they did. So it was a very, very different landscape than we had imagined previously. And the latest paper says there are 56 million people killed by diseases within the next century, but the real number may very well be closer to 100 million. So it was a very, very different landscape. So the landscape where the so-called red wolf today exists, in 1776, it was a black wolf that existed there. Now, how you work around that contradiction, I don't know, but there it is. So what you have in, yes, before wolves were introduced into Yellowstone National Park, the Canadian wolves, yes, indeed, there were a few wolves, native wolves in Idaho. And that was very belatedly admitted to, and we know even the number of packs which were around. But these, we have to understand also that in the ranch country, in Canada and in the United States, wolves were not tolerated. They were virtually totally exterminated. So the large wolves from Canada are large, or were large in Canada, because they were also expanding. We had in Canada also a severe reduction of wolves, and the wolves started to come back in the 1970s. So on Vancouver Island and in Alberta and so on and so forth, and the same problems, of course, developed. We have a pretty good idea what happens when wolves come into the landscape. So, for instance, I'm living on Vancouver Island, and when the wolves came in the 1970s, we had a deer kill on the island of about 25,000 deer a year. And after the wolves swept the island, it dropped to about 2,000 to 3,000. And the reason it didn't get any lower than that is because the deer fled completely into the cities, into the suburbs, and into the farming country. So the deer today are no longer found in the wilderness areas, in the background, in the forestry areas. They are found primarily living in town. And of course, they're a bit of a nuisance, to say the very least, and that's not a very happy situation. But this has been you find that everywhere. So, for instance, in Yellowstone Park, you had a reduction in the elk. The number of elk in the northern herd were about 19,500, maybe a bit more than that. And they dropped to today's number, which is around 4,000. And the reason that it's not lower than that is because the elk moved out of the park in masses onto private ranch lands where they were free of wolves. So that in the actual number of elk that remained behind in the park during winter is only around 500 or so. Yeah, it's a reduction from almost 20,000 to 500. Well, we had a similar reduction in Banff National Park. When I did my bighorn sheep studies in the 1960s and 70s, we had about 2,500 elk in the park. It was magnificent. We had elk bugling in every valley when the rutting season was on, and I did my observations and my descriptions, and I published a book on elk at that time. Well, when the wolves came in 1970s, it reduced the elk down to about 300, from 2,500 to 300. You see, it's same, proportionally the same decrease. And of course, these elk were hiding, and they were silent. They no longer bugled. So when I tried later on to go out with my students to observe elk, we saw nothing. It was just a waste of time. The countryside was silent, and the elk were no longer present there. Moose disappeared as well. I went in 2006. I was on an elk hunt in Wyoming, just south of the park. But we rode through Yellowstone Park extensively, in, around, and for a whole week, I was in some of the finest moose country you can possibly imagine. And I know something about moose. I've studied moose. I studied moose from the Alberta border all the way to Alaska. And so in the park and just outside the park, in the southern part, there was magnificent moose country. And we rode day in, day out, and we saw not a single moose. We saw not a single track. We saw not a single feeding site. And that was during the rutting season of moose, when the moose are most mobile, you see. And so I was told, yeah, the moose are dead because of global warming. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish.
Yeah.
And, of course, moose in Banff Park also disappeared. But not only that, in Alberta we had the phenomenon the same as in Wyoming, namely the elk moved out of the forestry reserve, where the wolves are rather active, onto private ranch lands. And the moose did one thing even better than that. They really moved out way, way beyond the foothills into the prairie country, so that we had for the very first time moose, big bulls for instance, sitting in the coulees in the prairies, literally 100, 200 miles out from the forestry reserve. That was not present when I was there as a professor. That is just a recent event. So the animals respond by getting out of the way of wolves. Perfectly understandable. But please just notice what you are doing now to your hunting. When you have a 90% reduction or more in wildlife on public land, what is there for you to hunt?
Right.
Well, you see, you're destroying your system of wildlife conservation. And your wildlife conservation is basically built around the idea that you have abundant wildlife on public land where citizens in good standing can go and hunt and partake of this. And of course, you are producing some of the best meat in the world, because elk and moose and deer and so on are fantastic from the nutritional perspective. I don't want to miss them. I have it in my freezer at the present time. Of course I hunt.
Well, and Dr. Geis, I was a county commissioner in Madison County, Montana, which adjoins the park, and I can attest very personally how the wild game move onto private property. They literally will go where the people are as a protection against the wolves, and a lot of these environmentalists and these so-called planners, they want to leave these wildlife corridors, and they want to have all this land available without humans on it. And the fact is, the wildlife, certainly the ungulates, look for humans because we're a protection for them.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
This actually was happening in the national parks previously. Just simply we thought that the reason that the animals did there is because there was no hunting. But the reality was that they tried to get protection from predators. And they do that by, you see, when the wolves came here in 1999, and they came out of the forests around it, they moved right away in amongst our houses here, and I had planted a small orchard of various apple trees and so on. I was looking forward to that. Well, I can tell you that orchard was gone in no time flat because the deer had suddenly appeared here. They weren't present here previously. I mean, they were present beyond in the meadows system, about 145 that I was able to count roughly. But once the wolves appeared, the deer completely vacated the countryside where the wolves were, and they were in amongst our houses, and of course they caused damage at that time point. I mean, the panic that these animals were under was something to behold, to say the very least. So I'm glad that you've actually seen some of this.
Well, we had a real serious problem in Madison County with the elk herds moving onto private land because then tear apart the haystacks, and they were grazing with the cattle, and it created also a concern about brucellosis.
Well, you see what is happening now, Don, is that your private land is now becoming the center for wildlife conservation.
Right.
Previously, it was public land. But if you continue on, as the court have ordered you to do, where you're going to put the big wolf everywhere where he was in the United States, and that means everywhere. You're basically replacing the coyote today with the big wolf. And the coyote is so well tolerated in much of its distribution that you're killing them roughly at about 1,000 coyotes a day. That's the control effort right now. And do you think you're going to be very happy when you have big wolves replacing the little wolf throughout your countryside?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
At any rate,
and the coyotes, well, everything learns how to habituate with the environment that they're in, and that's the important lesson of your 7 steps that you have included in your papers, and that is that in time, after they habituate, there is very definitely a time on that 6th and 7th steps where humans are really at risk.
Well, yes, they will be, but let's stay a little bit with this spread in the parks. You see, your national parks have just woken up to something. They've realized that throughout the decades of protection that they have placed on these natural landscapes in national parks, they've had a loss of biodiversity. That means species are going extinct while there is so-called protection in place. And at the same time, you have had invasive species spreading. And the number of invasive species in the U.S. national parks now exceeds 6,500. Well, and this is not nature conservation. That's a scandal.
It is a scandal, but
That's an absolute scandal.
Also, what's a scandal is that they try to blame it on global warming.
Well, whatever it is, there's some interesting things that fell out. So one of the things that the national park people complained about was said, well, yeah, of course we're losing biodiversity because our parks are too small. Well, do you ask yourself, how big do the parks have to be before natural biodiversity is more or less maintained? Well, we have a good example in Canada, Wood Buffalo National Park. You've got about 150 wolves there and about 2,000 bison. It fluctuates quite a bit back and forth, but they have maintained themselves. Well, do you know how big Wood Buffalo National Park is? It's bigger than Switzerland. Now, is this what you're going to be facing with? And while I'm at it, I've got to add something else here. You have Mark Vanderpool, the gentleman in California, who has been doing an outstanding piece of work in the last 30 years. He bought himself 14 acres of land on which there were 60 species of plants, native and non-native. And he decided to bring back the native plants from the seed beds that were still contained in the soil. And after 29 years, he had, if I remember correctly, 235 species of native plants and 135 species of non-native plants. Can you imagine that? Here is a human being who decided to restore biodiversity onto 14 acres of land. And while in the big parks, with all the protectionism, the biodiversity is going down. Species are going extinct. Invasive species are spreading. On his land, within 30 years, he went from 60 species of plants to over 300. Now, that's an enormous achievement. I mean, this is a hero, as far as I'm concerned, this man. And what he is doing is showing you that in order to maintain biodiversity, you cannot protect the landscape. You've got to go at it with axe and power saw and a hose and axe and whatever it is. You've got to be actively engaged in maintaining the native species which otherwise go extinct. So we're doing exactly the wrong thing by going out and protecting everything. We have to be on the landscape using fire and axe and spade and whatever it is in order to get back our native species. And this is going to be the great dilemma in the future here, because you've got enormous areas today under protection, and all you need to maintain biodiversity is small pieces of land.
Right.
When you do things properly.
And Dr. Gust, I have to tell you that their plan under UN Agenda 21, and I refer to this quite a bit, is that literally half of the United States will be without human population and will be highly protected, 50%.
Well, you have this in the West. You have the Bison Common, which the Turner Foundation is supporting, and so on and so forth. And they are doing this under the guise that they're just recreating natural landscapes. Well, they don't, because the bison, to begin with, is a dwarf. It's a man-made dwarf. Your bison is a small-bodied specimen that has been left over from about 12,000 years ago, when human beings began to exploit your native fauna using poisoned spears. And they were able to kill. That was a miracle weapon that they developed, because with these poisoned spears they could kill very quickly and very fast. And the so-called Folsom culture, about 12,000 years ago, lasted about 800, 900 years, and they were killing the bison of the day. And the bison of the day was a giant with wide spreading horns, but it was a giant that was not afraid of human beings. It was a giant that confronted human beings. But if the bison confronted the human beings, it could be thrown full of poisoned spears and would die. And in fact, the death rate of these bisons was enormous during the Folsom period. And what was left over, ultimately, was a dwarf bison that fled and was afraid of human beings. That's your current bison. So the bison that you're protecting is not a natural bison at all. It's that's a man-made artifact. The other thing is, of course, the so-called idea of the bison common was that before white men came to North America, the continent was filled with bison. Well, it was not. The bison were confined to the interior of the continent. They were not all that common, but they were common enough that people could live on them. And Alvarez Cabeza de Vaca, in fact, met bison 3 times in his travels, and he made the point that the natives living off bison were very well developed physically. Well, that happened again 200 years later, when the native people living off the resurging buffalo, the native Indians in the plains, the Sioux, and so on and so forth, the Buffalo Indians, developed into tremendously healthy, large, vigorous fighters. And my understanding was that they put the United States Army then into a dilemma, because they had 4 dead soldiers for every dead Indian. And that was the ultimate cause why the buffalo was exterminated, because it removed the foundation for the native people at that time point. But the important point is that the spread of bison from 1650 roughly to about 1776 in Pennsylvania and 1812 in California, that was the maximum extent to which the bison spread, was an artifact of human making. It was not natural at all. This is what the whole protectionism is suffering from. They think they're trying to rehabilitate native landscapes. Well, that's not the case. And besides, the prairie is so full of invasive species from Europe and Asia and Africa. There are very, very few native species left. And that was already known in the 1950s, for heaven's sake. At any rate, this is one of the interesting problems. And the other thing is the following. You and I, when you go hunting, we are limited in what we can use for killing. We have to ensure that when we kill a deer or a moose or an elk, that it's done humanely. And this is the law of the land. We treat wildlife with respect. We treat wildlife humanely. Well, how the heck do predators treat wildlife? I was on the flight sitting beside an elected member of our British Columbia Parliament, who was an ex-RCMP officer, and he had a trap line in northern Canada, and he told me of probably the filthiest case that I've run across. And he spoke of an attack by 4 wolves on a little bear, a black bear. And of course, the black bear defended itself and was bawling and running off, and its gut were dragging behind the bear. I mean, this is what happens to wildlife when carnivores are around. And as far as I'm concerned, yes, this is natural, but I don't have to choose that natural. Cancer is natural. I don't have to live with it. Right, tuberculosis is natural. I don't have to live with it. We have the choice, and my choice is to have a rich biodiversity on the landscape produced by human hands. I am there for productivity, and I'm there for the humane treatment of wildlife. That's what I opt for. And this is exactly what the environmentalists are destroying. Their idea is to have a landscape, so-called natural landscape, in which predators and prey balance out. Well, do you know what happens when you let the wolves just go? And I experienced that in my lifetime. I told you earlier on, I spent years in the Spazizi, northern British Columbia, studying, and this was a wildlife paradise. Well, it became a national park, a provincial park. Wolves were protected, basically. Within 20 years, one of my students flying the country, but were looking for opportunities to study caribou. Well, they found no caribou, but they saw a pack of 43 wolves. And 3 years ago, a friend of mine went on a vacation in that area, and he rode for 3 weeks on horseback through the countryside and never saw a single head of big game. So this is what you get from your protectionism. Yeah, you've got yourselves, and it's the polite way of putting it. It's called the predator pit. And
no, you're right. And have you thought? And this is something that I think a lot of people miss. Have you thought about the idea that if they can create these predator pits, if they can create the environment where there are no longer game animals out there, then they can attack hunting and they can attack the Second Amendment, because,
of course you can.
Well, there's no reason to have a gun if you can't hunt, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And a long time ago, in fact, I corresponded about that point with the National Rifle Association, and I made the point, I said that the most important protector of your right to carry arms is not your Second Amendment, but the presence of wildlife. If the wildlife goes, your Second Amendment has very little chance of surviving.
Right.
And by the way, you go to communist countries, you went to Mongolia, which was communist countries, because people depended on wildlife, they were armed, even under communism. Yeah?
Well,
so, no, you're absolutely right. The North American system of wildlife conservation depends on an armed citizenry. It's therefore not exportable to other countries.
Right, exactly. And I've noticed that, you were talking about the inhumane way that wolves kill. I live in rural southwest Montana. I'm like you. I want to get as far away from people as possible. And my wife, it's been probably 5 years ago now, was driving to work. She worked as a postmaster, and she came flying back to the house. I was a county commissioner at the time. And she said, "Dan, there's a gigantic black wolf up here on the south end of our property." And so I went down there. She went ahead and went to work, and I went down there, and there was a dying elk, a cow elk laying alongside the road, and her guts had been ripped out, and she was still alive. I carry a gun in my car. I actually shot her to put her out of her misery. But that was the way they kill their prey. And the fact is, it was a cow elk that had a calf. And so it's not that that these wolves and these predators are these wonderful natural parts of the natural environment. Part of the reason that I have aversions to wolves is because they kill an awful lot more than they actually consume. They are a killing machine, and we've got sheep and cattle in our country that end up dead, and then they're only maybe partially consumed or not even consumed at all.
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way. Wolves do not belong into settled landscapes. They do an enormous amount of damage. They've spread diseases. They're dangerous to human beings. And in the long run, you cannot maintain them anyway because they hybridize with coyotes and dogs and become coy dogs and eventually just simply feral dogs. So your attempts right now at conserving wolves under the Endangered Species Act is counterproductive. The best way...
I think it was intended to be counterproductive. I'll be real honest with you. I look at the people and the organizations behind the so-called reintroduction of wolves and other large predators, and these people are rabid environmentalists that make a ton of money off of their outreach to protect species. And in fact, I think it's a money-making machine, and it's also a program to get human population off the landscape.
Well, there's very, very little doubt that you have. Yes, it's a money-making machine, and that these environmentalists are trying to take human beings off the land. But it's important to realize what the land will look like. It will continue to be degraded. It will continue to lose species under protectionism. It will continue to lose productivity. It will have wildlife, and the wildlife will be subject to wolf predation, which in itself is pretty vulgar, as you have just described, and quite correctly described. So, as far as I'm concerned, Dan, I'm opting for the opposite. I want to have a landscape that is free of wolves, because in settled landscapes they hybridize anyway into extinction. So the best thing is what we've been doing, looking after the land and looking after it well, and making out of it something that is beautiful and productive and supports human life and human culture and so on and so forth. And the alternative is just simply unacceptable because it is so nihilistic, to say the very least. Well, there are many, many, many other things that are associated with the wolf. The amount of predation that, for instance, was taking place in Europe was quite startling, because the wolves just simply don't kill by killing each individual. They also spook animals, and they spook them over cliffs, or they press them against barns, and they suffocate, and so on and so forth. And the largest number that was recorded was in France, where wolves in one night managed to kill over 450 sheep. But at the same time, we have now a movement afoot, the vegans, which is becoming very popular, which are quite happy about the fact that maybe domestic animals will come off the land and we will all become vegetable eaters. So that is another social trend at the present time, not just simply rewilding the landscape without human beings, but also getting rid of ranching and getting rid of animal husbandry, because what these individuals believe in is that human beings should be eating plants and nothing else but plants. So that's the vegan. Now, the problem with veganism is, under natural conditions, when human beings were starving, and at times for a very long time, there was really nothing else to eat but vegetation. And again, if you go back to the time when Columbus came to this continent, it's roughly what Cabeza de Vaca was observing. The people were eating primarily plants, and they were eating roots and God knows what else, but it had to be cooked and baked and scraped and pounded and so on and so forth, very difficult to digest. And the only animal food that they had was literally spiders and insects and a few snakes and lizards that came along. But yes, our bodies are designed by nature to be able to take quite a bit of abuse nutritionally. And one abuse nutritionally is to put our body entirely on vegetable foods. And whereas in human history, where you can see meat eaters, they are usually tall, they're assertive, they're beautiful people. Probably the most outstanding ones were our so-called cave painters of Western Europe, about 400,000 to 25,000 years ago. They were eating primarily migratory reindeer and mammoths. That was another one of their favorite food. Well, they were so well developed that the average body size of the male was over 6 feet, and they had brain sizes 20% larger than ours today. I mean, that's embarrassing to talk about it, yeah? But here were people living entirely on animal diets, and they had a tremendous body development. Well, that's, of course, exactly the same thing what happened to the so-called Buffalo Indians about 200 years ago. They were tremendously well developed, and they were fantastic fighters. And that was what was so painful to the U.S. Army and was intolerable, and that's why the buffaloes had to go. So I have seen with my own eyes when fanatical vegans raise children, and these poor things were small, underdeveloped, and sick. What else do you have when you get for lunch a slice of watermelon, and that's it? Yeah, There's very, very poor nutrition. So we have had a culture which I think had exploited the landscape sanely, which of course humanized the landscape in Europe, of course, as well as North America. And it's very hard to see what else you can do with a burgeoning population. Yes, we must retain wilderness. I understand that. I have been involved in creating national parks. In fact, the biggest ecological reserve in British Columbia is my old study area of stone sheep in the Spatsizi. We created that, and it is a huge area that has been set aside for total protection. So I've been involved in that. And I was very much involved in getting national parks in the Yukon Territory, for instance. But I also now realize that in order to retain any value in these protected areas is that you have to go in and you have to manage for very, very human goals, which is increased biodiversity, productivity, and you have to do that with hands-on management. We cannot afford the negative effects of protectionism. So that's,
I agree.
Yeah, that's coming.
Well, and you certainly have plenty of examples of how, when they've tried to manipulate the environment the way the radical environmentalists are trying to change things, it's all counterproductive. Certainly, most of it. Yeah.
Well, it is counterproductive. Much of the time, it's done, like it or not, in good faith, in the sense that people don't think what they're doing. They're following trends. And it is in great vogue right now, protectionism and veganism and so on. And it is, in fact, they're quite happy that the wolves are doing damage to livestock producers, because that will mean that they cannot exist, and therefore livestock will be off the land, and we don't have to worry about methane and its effect on global warming and so on and so forth. And that's just part and parcel of the story, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, and the bottom line on all these crazy programs that we're talking about, be it veganism, be it all the wolf introductions, UN Agenda 21, you name it, these programs are there to promote government control, to promote a system that controls every aspect of our lives. And it's the exact opposite of what this country was founded on.
No, I understand that. Yeah, and I'm a Canadian by choice, by the way, not by the accident of birth. So I'm a North American, and I'm very much aware of the wonderful land that we have and the tremendous regeneration of wildlife that we produce, because wildlife, of course, was very severely damaged. Almost much of it was exterminated before the First World War, and then came along very dedicated people to return wildlife to what it could possibly be. Well, the wood duck was virtually extinct, and today it's one of the common birds. The pronghorn antelope was down to a very, very few small isolated pockets, and today it's a widespread animal. Most of the elk that you find are from elk introduced from Jackson Hole. because that's what they were reduced to. So we went in North America from a virtual extermination of wildlife into a system of wildlife conservation that was enormously productive and returned, as I said, biodiversity, returned wildlife, returned beauty to the land, because the land is beautiful when you have wildlife. And today, go to Banff National Park and you don't see anything anymore. Wildlife is gone.
And it was hunters and the Pittman-Robertson Fund and hunters that were responsible for a lot of those improvements in the hunting.
Yeah, no, that was correct. And this is the Achilles heel, pardon me, please, of the North American system. That it was largely created by individuals that were quite affirmative about consumption of wildlife. And wildlife was there to be used and every citizen in good standing had access to it. And that was the beauty of the North American system. You see, the Russians tried to introduce that after the fall of communism. And I was involved in that. And they translated some of my papers into Russian and published them in Russian hunting journals and natural history journals. But, of course, they failed. The oligarchs got the best of it. And so wildlife is no longer in the concern of the public. It's in the hands of more or less private interests as such, which is a pity.
It certainly is. Well, I know that the wolf population in Russia was very well controlled when the Soviets were doing a lot of training out in Siberia.
No, not quite. Sorry, Dan. I've got to disagree here. It was not well controlled.
Okay. Well, you go ahead.
No, indeed. What happened historically is the following. The wolf was, in Russia as well as in other European countries, during the medieval times and into modern times, a curse on the land. That's what they looked upon it. It was not only because of the predation, but also by, and we didn't speak about that, and that is the when the wolves have an illness. I'm thinking
the disease. Sure.
Yeah, that's rabies. That's right. And rabies was incredibly feared for a very good reason, because even a nick from a wolf's tooth was actually a death sentence to a human being. And when wolves became infected with rabies, they went berserk, and they went through the countryside attacking everything, including in modern times machineries, tractors, bicycles, and God knows what else, and human beings, and cattle, and everything that was in their path. Well, today we have some medical means of preventing death, but in former times it was not, and this is one reason why the wolf was so feared enormously in the past. Well, in Russia, in much of the landscape in Central Europe, France and England and so on, the wolves were controlled very effectively by in the Middle Ages, except of course when there was war. When there was war, then wolf population expanded, like in the 30-year war in Europe. After the war was over, large areas of land could not be settled again because they were so infested with wolves and it was so difficult to make a living. But it created an incentive to go and control wolves, and this was by and large done. Now in Russia, they had an exception because they continued to have a mortality of at least 200 people a year from wolf predation. And we have some very good books which we have now been able to translate into English, which speak about this problem and so on and so forth. But when the Communist Party came to power, they tried to subdue all the reports on wolf problems because they felt that this is something that was intolerable in a modern forward-looking state, which they considered Russia to be under communist rule. And so they prohibited the publications, in fact, of any of the wolf attacks on people and so on and so forth. And they generated a culture of ignorance. Now, during the Second World War, when the Russians were scraping the barrel for manpower, believe it or not, they went through all the villages and they recruited not only the young men but the older men and into the Red Army. And in the process of recruiting these men, they also took away their weapons. So that over large areas of Russia, in fact, all of Russia practically, people were now without firearms. And the wolves started taking advantage of it. And so when the war ended in 1945, they had a real big problem on hand. There were wolves killing people. They were getting into livestock. Not only that, they were getting into or settlements. They were getting into buildings. They broke into protected areas and killed livestock there. And that livestock was precious because there was so much hunger going on at that time point. So the Russians then, after the Second World War, again started a culture, a system of reducing wolves, and they have been reducing that more or less till the breakdown of communism took place. But by and large, when you look at the situation globally, wolves were not tolerated because they generated everywhere severe damage. One of the few apparent and temporary exceptions was Japan, because in Japan, the wolves were considered a holy animal. They built shrines for wolves, and the reason for that was that when the samurai disarmed the peasants were no longer able to protect their land against deer and pigs, which were preying on their fields, and so they attracted wolves in order to make sure that these pigs and deer in Japan were controlled. Well, that worked for a while, worked very well for a while, and then rabies broke out. And a rabid wolf is something so terrible, so unbelievably terrible, and the results are so hideous because people die. The Japanese didn't have any means to stop the death from rabies. So they began to exterminate the wolf, and they succeeded by 1905. So here was a country that went from eulogizing wolves to their total destruction. Now, the only places where wolves were tolerated were some native tribes in North America, which lived off fish and waterfowl resources. Because what happens is that when wolves are allowed to spread through the landscape, yes, they kill off big game, but they also kill off the so-called mesopredators. You see, most people, when we're talking about wolves, we think about them primarily killing moose and elk and deer. But no, they kill everything. They kill ground-nesting birds. They kill grouse and rabbits. And I'm living this here because it's now a great rarity to hear a grouse drumming in springtime. Because they clean out virtually, they have to, because they're trying to maintain themselves alive, and they're very, very good hunters. So when they kill off the mesopredators, which are the mink, the raccoons, the foxes and coyotes and so on, what happens is that populations of fish, which are spawning in shallow waters, are no longer preyed upon and reproduce very well. And the other thing that reproduces very well is waterfowl. And so native tribes, which were eating quite a bit of this waterfowl and fish, in fact protected wolves, because that is what generated to them their food supply. And that, by the way, is also what you found when Cabeza de Vaca went into Florida. Well, he made the point that, yes, there were a few mountain lions still alive, and there were a few skins. And the skins were utilized by the elite amongst the natives, and the natives introduced other furs, and the furs they introduced, as I can read and can make out, was mink. But you see, when you get rid of coyotes and wolves, and Cabeza de Vaca never saw a wolf or a coyote, he never saw the skin of a wolf or a coyote. Yeah? When you do that, of course, you're going to have a large number of mink on the landscape. And if you have a large number of mink and other little predators in the landscape, you don't have fish. You don't have waterfowl. So when I'm reading, for instance, Cabeza de Vaca, who was a falconer, and he's reported his findings to a king, or actually an emperor, Charles V, who was a falconer and a great hunter. And he's, by the way, the gentleman who's known for the Maltese falcon. Maltese falcon, you heard about that. Well, this was a treaty that Charles V generated with knights. He gave them the island of Malta, and he received in return 1 falcon a year. And falconry in the medieval times was the craze. They eulogized that. And the largest area that he hunted in was just the other side of Seville, which is today Donana National Park. And this is where a concentration of birds settled there, and this is where that Charles V did most of his falconry, in fact. So when Cabeza de Vaca reported back to the king, he spoke very much about the bird life and the animal life that he saw. And what he didn't see is equally important. Namely, if you have a large number of, if you get rid of the wolves and you have a large number of mink and other things around the shorelines and so on, you don't have any turtles. You don't have too many fish. You don't have too much waterfowl. And in reading, yes, he does see ducks and geese and so on and so forth, but he doesn't see too many of them. And that's exactly what you expect if you have a control of large predators, and mesopredators have a way of spreading. You see? These are all ecological effects, and you can read them in the treatise, as I said, of one Alvarez Cabeza de Vaca.
That's fantastic. That's such good information, Dr. Geist, that I don't think most people even have any concept of how so intricately the control of wildlife has been throughout history.
That's right.
And how what an impact it has on everything. And what we're doing today with the large predators, with wolves and with grizzly bears and the so-called apex predators, are basically just more of the same things that we've done for countless generations, and the impacts are going to be just as deadly as they were before. It's just in a different way.
That's right, and you will eventually not tolerate that because you will get to the point where children will be killed by wolves in Europe, for instance. The day is approaching. And once that has happened, and this used to happen again and again and again, it's simply that we don't learn from history. We learn from history that we don't learn from history. But if you go back to history, you will discover that child killing was very widely spread. Right now, for instance, it was happening in Israel. Yeah, in Israel National Parks, they have some wolves. Well, they've got a shortage of wildlife, no two ways about it. So the wolves have been attacking children. Well, that's exactly what wolves have been doing through the ages.
Sure.
It's nothing unusual. That's perfectly normal, in fact, yeah. And by the way, the native people didn't tolerate any grizzly bears either. Again, Cabeza de Vaca went through Texas and into Mexico. He never saw a grizzly bear. He reported of black bear being found in Florida, but he never saw skin. And the skin of black bears, and I can speak from personal experience, is just a wonderful, wonderful thing to sleep on.
No, they are. You're right, and that's the thing that's so amazing to me. I don't know if you've seen this latest little attempt by the environmentalists to protect grizzly bears, but now there's a bill in the U.S. Congress, and Grijalva from Arizona is the chairman of that, and they're trying to turn all grizzly bear protections over to the Native Americans. Well, guess what? This is a really stupid thing. You turn that over to a group like that, they're going to love them until there's so many of them that they're destroying their people and their way of life, and then they're going to start killing them right and left.
Of course they are. Yeah. Well, but right now we have the sad situation where the grizzly bears are now totally protected in British Columbia, and the end result is predictable because grizzly bears are very intelligent animals, and they eventually discover that they don't have to fear anything about human beings, and so there will be attacks on humans, and there will be a lot of killing of grizzly bears. And, well, I know when I was a young biologist in Wells Gray Provincial Park in the 1960s, we had a lot of grizzly bears, and they were very well behaved, extremely well behaved. The reason was everybody that they met carried a gun. And human beings that carry guns are very brave. They don't pussyfoot around. They walk through the countryside boldly. And grizzly bears are very, very sensitive to that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing was that while everybody in the countryside in those days carried a gun, there were no hikers. That is something that came much later, you see.
Mm-hmm.
Every human being that the grizzly bears met in the 1950s and 60s in Wells Gray was either a hunter or a guide, an outfitter, or a prospector or a biologist, and we all carried weapons. And the grizzly bears were invisible. And nobody wanted to kill them anyway, because what the hell do you want to kill a grizzly bear for? It's no damn good to eat. We had a large moose population in those days. If you wanted to kill something, well, you killed yourselves a moose, because that was something you can eat.
Mm-hmm.
But grizzly bears
Right.
were of no interest. And the only grizzly bear that I knew of that had been killed in Wells Gray Provincial Park in the 1950s and 60s, that's a huge park, by the way, was one that was taken by my friend Faye Hartman on request of the museum in Victoria. They wanted to have skin, skull, and skeleton of a grizzly bear, and so one was killed above Azure Lake. I know exactly where it was killed. But that was the only one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody could hunt grizzly bears, but nobody wanted to hunt grizzly bears.
Right.
Yeah. Now, to give you an idea how prevalent animals big game was, I was hunting moose on the 23rd of December, 1958. And in the morning of that day, I had crawled from behind of a big ridge, which was, of course, covered deeply in snow, and I was lying on top of a cornice, and I was looking down on the slope on which there were moose, and my friend was 1.5 miles away with a spotting scope looking my way. Well, he counted 36 moose on that hillside. Oh, that's unbelievable today. It's because moose are so scarce now.
Yeah.
Or when my young wife and I, in 1961, went to the Spasisi Plateau, and our very first morning we met a congregation of caribou bulls. There was a mass of milling bodies about 250 yards across, and the antlers formed a moving wall. That's how abundant caribou were. And this phenomenon in the early rut is something that is found once in a while amongst barren ground caribou. That's the gathering of the bulls. And we don't know exactly why it happens, but it does happen. And it simply indicated at that time how abundant these animals were. But of course, they were living in a situation where there was wolf control going on, because the guide and outfitter could not afford to have his horses killed when they were wintering in that countryside. So they were looked after, and the wolves were being looked after as well. And we had a wonderful situation of very, very abundant wildlife for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And, it's you mentioned the moose, but moose are particularly preyed upon by wolves, because a moose will stand and fight, and they're a big animal and they'll stand and fight. And I know in Ted Lyon and Will Graves' book, right on the cover, the real wolf, right on the cover is a cow moose with a calf, and you can see that the calf has been attacked, and he's got a huge bite out of his hip, and this cow moose is trying to protect this calf.
Oh, yeah.
They end up literally wherever the wolves move in, the moose go extinct, and it really is that way, isn't it?
That's right. That's correct. Yeah, that's right. No, I know what you're talking about. I studied moose, and I'm very, very familiar with how they try to handle predators. I've been on snowshoes around them in wintertime, and so on and so forth. Yeah, they do, and they try to get themselves onto a little spot of flat land, something like a frozen lake. Yeah, when they see me coming or wolves coming, they try to go there because that's where they can spin around in every direction and flail out, not just with the front legs, but also with the hind legs. And they're very, very good at kicking precisely. Very good at it, yeah. Wolves don't like eating moose particularly. They much prefer caribou, and they much prefer deer and elk And they don't like horses very much either, because horses' hoofs are something to be dealt with, but they will eventually kill horses. Just like, for instance, right now, they are not killing too many bison in Yellowstone Park, and the bison are expanding and destroying the landscape in the park. But they've done a wonderful job controlling bison in Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada. And it's a very brutal sight. And in fact, one of my friends who studied wolves there wrote in his book, I am not a believer in reincarnation, but dear Lord, should I be wrong, please make sure that I do not return to this earth as a buffalo in Wood Buffalo National Park, and here is my reason why. That's a pretty horrible story.
Yeah.
Certainly is.
Well, Dr. Geist, we're running toward the end of our program, and I want to thank you for all of the information that you brought to our listeners. Now, I want to give you an opportunity to maybe tell our listeners how they can find out more about you and some of the programs you're working on, and also if you've got any references that you would like to recommend to them that they can go and find out for themselves what wolves are really all about.
Well, you mentioned already some of the books. The Real Wolf is one book which is very useful. Another book that started it all off was the book by Will Graves. And I was the one who edited that book, by the way, Wolves in Russia. The trouble, of course, it's out of print, and it's very difficult to get a decent second-hand copy. But whether you like it or not, if you become involved and are interested in the wolf situation, there's a lot of sources on the Internet. And there is, for instance, Wolf Education International, which I have contributed to, and it produces quite regularly interesting updates on what's going on. All the papers that I published are there, and they've also been translated into German and are being utilized. So today we're living in an information age, and it's perfectly possible to get decent information on wolves. But please be aware from where it's coming, because you can get a lot of misinformation as well. And it comes from the protectionist sources, and where they're not dealing with science, they're dealing with fantasy. They are very interested in, as I said, so-called naturalistic landscape that controls itself. We don't need any human beings on it, and so on and so forth. It has to do a lot with ideology and nothing with science. But
no, that's right. And we referenced this earlier in the broadcast, and it really has turned into a money game for most of these environmental groups. They've got a cash cow here by promoting some of these crazy programs.
And as I said, there are poor people suffering outside, and that's part of it. Just remember that the relationship of humans and wolves goes back a long, long, long ways. There's a lot of historical material available on it. And every country that has had wolves always came to the same conclusion. They had to be controlled. And if they lived at low numbers, we could tolerate them, but not in high numbers, ever. And the most important thing is today to remember that your legislation that is spreading wolves throughout your countryside is detrimental to wolves themselves. It's not just detrimental to people. Very detrimental to people, but also very detrimental to wolves. So with friends like that, the wolf doesn't need any enemies.
Right, exactly. And that's why I think it's important to realize that any time human beings get involved in the natural environment, certainly if there's any profit motive there, there are going to be impacts. And we need to look at this from a scientific standpoint and understand that there are a lot of forces behind these things that are there for the very wrong reasons. Dr. Geist, I want to mention, too, that this radio program, we were dedicating this to the memory of my good friend Bob Fanning,
Yeah.
He was a fearless fighter for integrity in government, the sanctity of private property, exposure of UN Agenda 21, and the importance of America's farmers and ranchers in our economic and cultural survival as a free and lasting constitutional republic. Bob, my good friend Bob, passed away on Christmas Eve, 2018, and I want certainly, and I know we've talked about this between us, I want our listeners to realize how much of his time and his effort and his money Bob put into this whole process.
Yeah, and he was a very good man, and he actually observed a lot of the things that I was talking about personally.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a pity that we don't live forever, and he was certainly a very good man.
Yes, he was. That's for sure. He's a good friend, too. Well, Dr. Geis, thank you again for being our guest on Connecting the Dots, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to visit on this subject. I applaud everything you're doing. I appreciate all the information that you're passing along to people all over the world. And I really do ask our listeners to try to follow some of the things that are going on and what are behind some of the forces that are behind some of these crazy programs. I believe that the more you read, the more you learn, the more you realize that this process is something other than science. So with that, thank you again, and I ask our listeners to tune in again next week and help us connect the dots. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the Republic. We're losing our freedom in the land.